James Harris had been waking up at 5 every morning for as long as he could remember. The sound of an old wind chime outside his window marked the beginning of each day, swinging gently in the morning breeze that rolled down from the hills behind his farm. His small house sat at the edge of a pasture, white paint peeling in places, but sturdy as ever. The fields were quiet, still damp with dew, and the cows had just begun to stir. James didn't move quickly, not because of age, but because he never had. Everything he did was measured, intentional. His bones were old, sure, but his spirit moved with a discipline that hadn't faded since his military days. He didn't think about the past much, not unless it barged into the present. Today, he thought, would be like any other. But it wouldn't be. He rolled his shoulder as he slipped into his grease-stained denim jacket and looked toward the barn. His John Deere tractor had broken down yesterday, and he had already diagnosed the issue. The hydraulic pump coupling was done for. He needed a specific part, one not easily found in town, but there was a hardware shop that had helped him before. That meant a ride into town. James didn't own a car. He didn't need one. What he did own, carefully covered in a faded tarp in the barn, was his old companion, a 1970 Harley-Davidson shovelhead. He pulled the tarp back like he was revealing a part of himself. The bike was dusty, a little weathered, but the chrome still caught the light, and when he turned the key, the engine growled to life like thunder rolling through the valley. The sound alone stirred birds from trees. James swung his leg over and sat, letting the vibration sink into his bones. It was a feeling he cherished, freedom wrapped in steel and smoke. 82 years old, and he still rode better than most 20-somethings. Not because of speed, but awareness. Every sound, every shift of the wind, every car on the road, he felt it all. That's what years in the military taught you. Situational awareness wasn't something you turned off. He rode out slowly, the morning sun warming his back as he took the narrow road winding from his farm to the highway. The countryside rolled past in blurs of green and gold, and the scent of freshly turned earth filled the air. It was spring, his favorite time. Everything was alive, but not loud. As he approached the outskirts of town, the road straightened and traffic picked up. He wasn't in a rush, but he kept pace. Cars passed him without a second glance. Some gave him a curious look. Old man on a rusted motorcycle, they probably thought. What they never saw, what they never could see, was who he really was. The town came into view, quiet on a mid-morning weekday. He slowed at the traffic light by the gas station, the same one he'd been using for 15 years. Marcus, the owner, usually waved at him when he rode by. Today, Marcus was inside, wiping down the counter. James didn't notice him. He was too focused on the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Blue and red. A patrol car had pulled up behind him. He stayed still, hands firm on the handlebars. The Harley's engine purred beneath him, a sound that brought him calm. A young officer stepped out of the cruiser. Mirrored sunglasses, crisp uniform, confident stride, she walked toward him like she already knew everything she needed to. James didn't move. He watched the horizon ahead as if nothing behind him could shake him. The officer stopped just to his left, one hand already resting on her weapon. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, her tone sharp with disbelief. James didn't answer right away. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He just didn't see the point in reacting to a question meant to provoke. The second officer emerged, male, taller, clearly newer. He walked around the bike, giving it a once-over with a smirk. "This Harley's older than my dad," he chuckled. "Look at all that rust." The female officer cut in, her voice more clipped now. "License and registration." "Step off the bike, sir." James nodded slightly and reached slowly into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed over the documents. His movements were deliberate, practiced, and calm. The officer flipped through them, pausing when she saw his age. 82. Don't you think you're a little too old to be riding a motorcycle? Still, James said nothing. He looked past her, toward the town beyond, as if his mind were already there. The male officer stepped closer. Hands on the bike. Feet apart. He didn't say it like a question. James complied, not because he had to, but because he didn't want to escalate anything. The officers began a search, of his jacket, his saddlebags, his bike. It was unnecessary, and they knew it. But they did it anyway. Across the street, Marcus had seen the lights. He stepped out of the gas station, squinting. When he saw who was being stopped, his stomach twisted. That wasn't just any old man. That was James Harris. A man he'd seen ride that same bike with dignity for over a decade. Always respectful, always on time. A good man. A quiet man. Marcus felt something bitter crawl up his spine. This wasn't right. Back at the stop, the officers continued pressing. Where do you live, Mr. Harris? Do you have family? Are you alone? James answered what needed answering and ignored the rest. The crowd was forming. People were pulling out phones, whispering. He heard snippets. Poor old guy, don't they have better things to do? He looks kind of out of it. James closed his eyes briefly. He took a deep breath. He had been in far more dangerous situations than this. He had once stood his ground under fire, led men through chaos, seen friends fall beside him. But that was long ago. Now, he was just an old man being humiliated for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The light turned green. The Harley idled patiently. The officer's voice sharpened. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us. James slowly opened his eyes, his gaze steady. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just looked at her the way a general once looked at a young recruit, full of patience, sadness, and a deep, unwavering calm. And far away, down a quiet phone line inside a military base, a voice said, "Did you say James Harris? Hold on. We're sending a unit now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" The green traffic light seemed meaningless now. James Harris remained still atop his Harley, the rumble of the engine a quiet protest against the sudden intrusion on his morning. The air was warm, but a sharp tension had crept into the space between him and the two uniformed officers. Officer Ava Johnson stood tall, arms stiff at her sides, her mirrored sunglasses reflecting the rising sun and the old man before her. She had been on the force for 3 years, ambitious, sharp, determined to do everything by the book, but sometimes the book didn't tell the whole story. Beside her stood Officer David Lopez, newer to the job, less tense, but clearly unsure of what exactly they had stopped. Ava took a step closer. "Sir, I asked you to turn off the engine and step off the motorcycle. I won't ask again." Her voice had the hard edge of authority she'd been trained to wield, but it lacked the weight of experience. James Harris slowly turned the key, and the Harley growled into silence. The quiet that followed was heavy. He kept his hands on the handlebars, not out of fear, but from sheer discipline. His eyes, calm and distant, stayed fixed ahead, as though nothing happening around him could shake his inner balance. Lopez walked around the bike, inspecting it like a museum piece. "Man, this thing's a relic," he muttered. "Still holding together though. Guess the old guy's been holding it together too." Ava shot him a quick glare. "Professional, David," she snapped. Then to Harris, "License and registration." Harris reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a weathered brown leather wallet. No sudden moves, no hesitation, just quiet, confident control. He handed her the documents wordlessly. Ava flipped through them, her eyebrows raising slightly at the birthdate. 82. She glanced at Lopez. "Don't you think that's pushing it?" Lopez gave a half shrug, unsure whether to laugh or not. Well, he made it here without crashing. Ava wasn't amused. She turned back to Harris. Sir, at your age, riding a motorcycle like this could be dangerous. For you, and for others. Do you understand that? Harris remained silent, his face unreadable. Ava frowned. I'm talking to you. Do you hear me? Lopez leaned in slightly and whispered, he might be hard of hearing, Ava. Look at him, he's barely reacting. Ava raised her voice. Mr. Harris, I need you to respond. Do you understand why we stopped you? James took a slow breath, still not speaking. In his mind, there was nothing to explain. He hadn't broken any law, hadn't caused any disruption, hadn't endangered a soul. The only threat in the situation was the assumption being made, that his age defined his ability, that his silence meant confusion. But James had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the sharpest answer. The kind that made people uneasy. A few feet away, a mother with a stroller slowed down, watching. A man in a delivery van paused mid-step, phone in hand, pretending to scroll while recording. The crowd was growing. Whispers floated on the air. Is he okay? Why are they bothering him? He looks like he knows exactly what he's doing. Yet to the officers, especially Ava, this was becoming an issue of compliance. Procedure. Control. I'm going to ask you one last time, Ava said firmly, placing one hand on her hip, the other hovering near her holstered weapon. Are you refusing to answer a law enforcement officer? James turned his head slightly toward her. His voice, when it came, was deep and calm. I'm listening. Ava blinked. Then answer me. Do you think it's responsible to ride a machine like this at your age? Harris looked back to the road. I've been riding for 65 years. Never caused an accident. Lopez chuckled nervously. Yeah, but now it's different. Slower reflexes, impaired vision, right? That's just how it goes. James didn't reply. He didn't need to. He didn't come to town to argue or justify his existence. Across the street, inside the gas station, Marcus Williams had been watching everything through the front window. The moment he saw Harris's bike pulled over and the officer's posture, he knew something was wrong. He wiped his hands on a rag and stormed toward the phone. This wasn't just some old man being inconvenienced, this was James Harris. He had known the man for over 15 years. Rain or shine, James came to fill his tank, pay in cash, and exchange a few words that always carried quiet wisdom. He had never raised his voice, never lost his temper. If there was anyone in this town who deserved dignity, it was him. Marcus grabbed the receiver and dialed the Fort Carson military base. This is Marcus Williams from Monroe Station. I need to speak to someone immediately. It's urgent. On the street, things escalated. Ava, growing increasingly frustrated with what she perceived as obstinance, took a step closer. Sir, I'm going to ask you to get off the motorcycle and come with us to the station. Harris didn't flinch. On what grounds? Ava hesitated. Her training hadn't prepared her for resistance that wasn't loud or violent. For your safety. And for a medical evaluation. We believe your behavior may indicate confusion or impairment. James looked at her the way he once looked at new recruits, full of patience, but also disappointment. The kind that said, you don't know what you're doing, but you will one day. Lopez shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should just let him go, Ava. He's not hurting anyone. But Ava had already made her decision, and backing down now felt like weakness. She was in too deep. No, she said. We need to be sure. He's coming with us. The crowd stirred again, sensing something unjust. The mother with the stroller shook her head and muttered, "This is wrong." The delivery man had stopped pretending, he was recording openly now. Inside the gas station, Marcus was still on the phone. Yes, James Harris. 82 years old. He's being harassed by local police in front of my station. It's not right. The voice on the other end changed immediately. Did you say James Harris? Stay on the line. We're sending someone now. Do not let anything happen to him. Back on the sidewalk, Ava reached for her handcuffs. Mr. Harris, I'm giving you a lawful order. Step off the bike and come with us. James looked straight at her, expression unchanging. I'm not going anywhere. The moment hung in the air like held breath. All around them, the world seemed to pause. And then, in the far distance, a low rumble began to rise. Faint at first, but growing. Not thunder. Not traffic. Something heavier. Stronger. A sound James recognized before anyone else. He didn't look, but he knew. Help was on the way. Not because he had called. But because there were still men in the world who remembered who he was. The tension in the air was thick enough to silence the birds. Officer Ava Johnson stood her ground, a picture of authority drawn in stiff lines and forced certainty, while James Harris remained still on his bike, a mountain unmoved by weather. A quiet storm was brewing, not in the sky, but among the people who had begun to gather around the scene. It started with a few glances from passers-by, curious heads turning as they crossed the intersection. Then came the strollers, the workers on lunch break, the older couple from the bakery next door. Within minutes, a dozen people stood scattered on the sidewalk and near the gas station, watching an old man and a pair of young officers in a standoff that didn't look like it should have happened in the first place. James could hear the whispers. Who is he? Why won't they let him go? He's just sitting there. Why are they treating him like a criminal? A man with a faded baseball cap muttered under his breath, somebody needs to step in. This is messed up. Another woman began recording, angling her phone carefully to capture both officers and the silent rider. The footage would later go viral, but in that moment, it was simply one more eye on a growing problem. Inside the gas station, Marcus Williams pressed the phone harder to his ear as the voice on the other end shifted from casual to clipped and urgent. Did you say James Harris? The voice repeated. Yes. He's outside my station. They've got him surrounded. They're treating him like some kind of threat. It's out of hand. The officer on the line went quiet for a second before answering, Sir, stay on the scene. We are dispatching a unit from Fort Carson immediately. Do not let those officers detain or touch him. He is not to be harmed. We'll be there within 15 minutes. The call ended, and Marcus stood still, phone pressed to his chest, heart pounding. He'd known James for years, 15 to be exact. And never once had the man spoken of the military, of titles, of medals, or ranks. He just came in, paid for his fuel, and left with a nod. But something in that officer's voice told Marcus there was a side to James Harris he had never seen. A side the world was about to remember. Across the street, the officers were still pressing. Ava's voice had lost its calm edge, now replaced by irritation, her tone louder and sharper. Sir, this is your last chance. Refusal to comply will result in physical detainment and transportation to a medical facility for evaluation. Lopez shifted nervously beside her, clearly unsure about how far they were going. Ava, maybe we're going too far here. I mean, look at him. He hasn't done anything. Ava didn't look at him. Her pride had become armor, and she wasn't about to strip it off now, not in front of a growing audience. James closed his eyes for a moment. Not in resignation, but in restraint. He had been humiliated before. He had been underestimated before. But never on such a public stage, and never by those who were supposed to protect, not provoke. His breath was steady. His posture unchanged. It wasn't arrogance, it was endurance, the kind forged in fire and sharpened by loss. Ava took another step forward. I'm going to need you to get in the vehicle now. James opened his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, he said calmly, evenly, like stating the color of the sky. Lopez glanced around. The crowd had doubled. Phones were up. Some people were muttering in frustration, others watching in stunned silence. One elderly man whispered, "He looks like he's been through wars, doesn't he?" Another nodded, "Yeah. And they're treating him like some drunk off the street." The line between order and overreach had become blurred, and the audience could see it. Ava, aware of the eyes on her, pressed on. "We're within our rights to demand a psychiatric evaluation under elder protection laws when someone appears disoriented or potentially impaired." James gave her a small smile, the kind that came not from amusement but from recognition, a well-crafted excuse, not the truth. He'd heard that kind of talk before, in interrogation rooms, in battlefields, in diplomacy gone wrong. It always began with concern and ended with control. Then, in a voice that cut through the murmurs, he asked, "Officer Johnson, how long have you served?" Ava blinked. "Excuse me?" I said, "How long have you worn that badge?" 3 years, she replied cautiously. "Why?" James nodded slightly. "Long enough to believe you know everything. Not long enough to realize you don't." Ava bristled. "Sir, this isn't a game. We're trying to ensure your safety and the safety of others. By treating me like I'm broken. By doing our job," she snapped. Lopez tried to interject again, but Ava held up her hand, silencing him. Across the street, Marcus stood at the curb, watching the tension escalate. The sound of sirens hadn't come yet, but he knew help was en route. He didn't know what kind of man James had been in uniform, but he could see what kind of man he still was, a figure of calm in a storm of assumptions. The respect Marcus felt in that moment wasn't out of fear or admiration for medals. It was the kind of reverence reserved for those who carried dignity like armor, even when stripped of titles and praise. Back on the sidewalk, a child asked her mother, "Why are they yelling at the grandpa?" The woman hushed her gently, unsure what to say. Lopez looked over at Ava again. "We can still walk this back," he whispered. "This doesn't have to end badly." But Ava was too far in. Her pride had built a wall around her judgment, and now the only way out was forward. "If he refuses again, I'll call for backup and have him transported. He's a danger to himself." James looked at her and spoke just loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You see an old man. But you don't see the years. You don't see what they've taught me." The words hung in the air, lingering like the last notes of a hymn. Ava said nothing, but her hand drifted to her radio. Then, something shifted. Far down the road, beyond the gas station, a sound began to rise. At first it was faint, a low growl like distant thunder. But it grew louder, steadier, more deliberate. The heads of the crowd began to turn. Marcus's eyes widened. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years but remembered instantly. Engines. Military engines. Humvees. And they were coming fast. The crowd instinctively parted, murmurs turning into gasps. James didn't turn his head. He just sat, still and quiet, as the low rumble turned into a thundering charge. Ava looked up, confused. Lopez took a step back. Marcus stepped into the street, his heart hammering in his chest. The cavalry was coming. Not out of nostalgia or ceremony, but because they remembered. They remembered James Harris. Inside the operations center of Fort Carson, the morning had begun like any other. Routine patrol updates, security briefings, a few personnel transfers. Nothing remarkable until the phone rang on the desk of Lieutenant Andrew Chase, a junior officer handling civilian liaison calls. He almost let it ring again, distracted by paperwork, but something made him pick it up. "Fort Carson, this is Lieutenant Chase speaking," he said in a professional, unbothered tone. On the other end, Marcus Williams's voice was tight, urgent, almost trembling. Lieutenant, this is Marcus Williams. I'm a Gulf War vet and I own a gas station outside Monroe. We've got a serious situation. An elderly man is being harassed by two local officers right outside my store, and he's a vet. A good man. Name's James Harris. Chase's eyes skimmed the intake sheet in front of him. Another civilian complaint, he thought. Still, he stayed courteous. Sir, we appreciate the call. But unless there's direct military involvement, no, listen, Marcus cut in. James Harris. He's not just any vet. I've known him 15 years, and he never says a word about his service. But something tells me he was more than just a foot soldier. And judging by the way those officers are treating him like a senile old man, something needs to be done before it goes too far. Chase sighed but typed the name into the personnel database. It took just a second. Then another. His fingers froze over the keyboard. On the screen, a file opened. It didn't just display a name, it displayed a legend. Colonel James Marshall Harris. 3 tours in Vietnam. 2 in the Gulf War. Intelligence Director in Afghanistan. Bronze Star with Valor. Distinguished Service Cross. 4 Purple Hearts. Over 60 years in service and active advisory roles. Chase felt his throat tighten. The air in the room changed as he sat up straighter. Sir, he said slowly, can you repeat that name? James Harris. He's on a black Harley. Right outside my gas station. Chase stood. Stay where you are. Do not let anyone move him. I'm escalating this immediately. He ended the call without waiting for a response, turned, and walked straight into the command suite where Captain George Farrell was debriefing his team. Sir, Chase said, his voice sharp. We have a situation involving Colonel James Harris. Civilian officers have him detained outside Monroe. Reports indicate public harassment. Possibly forceful detainment. Farrell looked up, jaw tightening. Colonel Harris? Are you absolutely sure? Positive ID, sir. Confirmed through the veteran database. It's him. And the witness says the officers have no idea who they're dealing with. Farrell didn't waste another second. He barked orders with the crispness of a man used to acting fast. Scramble QRT units. 12 Humvees, full escort. I want 40 men prepped, armed, but non-combative. This is not a show of aggression. It's a show of respect. I'll lead the unit myself. The room shifted into high gear. Radios crackled. Soldiers sprinted. Weapons were checked and secured. Within 4 minutes, the base's quick response team was rolling out of Fort Carson with Farrell at the front. The convoy kicked up dust, engines roaring across open terrain. It wasn't often a legend called silently for help, but when he did, they answered. As the lead Humvee barreled forward, Farrell sat gripping the handle above his seat, heart pounding not from nerves but from memory. He had once been a scared 20-year-old private, fresh out of officer training, stationed in Kuwait. Colonel Harris had taken him under his wing, not just as a mentor but as a man who taught him how to lead. Farrell remembered Harris's voice, calm under fire, his precision in chaos, his absolute refusal to leave a man behind. That man had shaped his life, and now, that same man was being treated like a vagrant in his own country. That was not going to stand. Back on the road outside Monroe, the small-town silence had given way to something altogether more intense. The crowd had grown to nearly 30 now, spilling from the sidewalks to the gas station parking lot. All eyes were focused down the street where the sound had become unmistakable. 12 military Humvees appeared over the crest of the hill like a column of thunder, kicking dust into the sky. They moved with purpose, flanking the road, engines growling in unison like the synchronized breath of giants. Ava Johnson turned her head slowly, her mouth falling open. "What is that?" she whispered. Lopez stepped back, blinking hard. Those are military vehicles, he said, his voice unsure. What are they doing here? James Harris remained on his bike, hands resting calmly on the handlebars, his posture unchanged. But his jaw tightened slightly, eyes narrowing as he saw the convoy approach. Not in fear. In recognition. The lead Humvee stopped 10 feet away, and the others fanned out like an honor guard. From the first vehicle, a man stepped down with practiced authority. Captain George Farrell. His uniform immaculate, his medals gleaming in the sunlight. He walked straight toward Harris, eyes not on the crowd, not on the police, but on the man who had once saved his life. When he was 3 paces away, Farrell stopped, stood at attention, and snapped a salute. "Colonel Harris, sir." The words hung in the air like a clap of thunder. The crowd fell utterly silent. Ava and Lopez froze, staring in disbelief. "Colonel." "Salute." James Harris returned the gesture with a slow nod. The silence was deeper than awe, it was stunned reverence. Farrell turned slowly to the officers. "We were informed there was some sort of misunderstanding here," he said, his voice low but cutting. "Would either of you care to explain why Colonel Harris was stopped and interrogated in front of a crowd?" Ava stammered, We didn't know who he was." Farrell's gaze hardened. "And if he hadn't been a colonel? Would that have justified humiliating him?" "No, sir. It wasn't our intention." Farrell took a breath, steadying the heat rising in his chest. This man carried intelligence documents under fire. He's responsible for the survival of more than 100 soldiers. He trained half the field officers in this state. Including me. You owe him your job, your safety, and your silence. He turned back to Harris. "Sir, we're here to escort you home. Or anywhere you need." Harris shook his head slightly. "I'm fine, Captain. But I appreciate it." Farrell gave a firm nod. "Sir, we'll stay until you ride out." Behind them, the soldiers had formed a line, standing at parade rest. The road had turned into a corridor of respect, a living monument for a man who had served and been forgotten, until now. Ava lowered her head, cheeks burning. She had no words. The entire town had just learned the lesson she should have known the moment she saw his eyes. The road stood still beneath the rising heat of late morning, a surreal stillness cloaked in diesel fumes and disbelief. A corridor of soldiers lined both sides, standing tall in full combat uniform, weapons holstered, eyes straight ahead. Their presence was not a threat but a tribute. The crowd that had once watched with mild curiosity was now transfixed, phones lowered, mouths closed. Even the most cynical onlookers knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. James Harris sat silently on his Harley, his weathered hands resting on the handlebars as if sculpted from bronze. He had not asked for this moment. He had not summoned help. But it had come, all the same, because some men command respect not by demand but by the weight of their life's service. Officer Ava Johnson felt like the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She stood awkwardly, unsure where to place her hands or how to regain control of a situation that had slipped through her fingers the moment the first Humvee appeared. Her training had never covered this, how to de-escalate after making the wrong call in front of 50 soldiers and half the town. She watched Captain Farrell with a mix of dread and admiration, the kind that came when you realized the person in front of you didn't just outrank you in protocol, but in life. Lopez remained beside her, less tense now but still quiet, unsure if stepping forward would help or make things worse. "Colonel Harris," Farrell said again, his voice lower, more personal now, "will remain on standby until you give the word." James gave a faint nod and returned his gaze to the road, not out of indifference but reflection. He was remembering something, perhaps a younger face, a different war, a time when a salute was more than a gesture. Ava took a small, shaky breath and finally stepped forward. Her voice cracked slightly. "Sir, I didn't know. I had no idea who you were. I didn't mean any disrespect. James turned his head slowly to look at her, his eyes calm but unreadable. That's the problem, officer. Respect isn't something you give because of who someone is. It's how you treat people when you think they're no one. The words hit her harder than any reprimand could. The crowd murmured, not in judgment now but in agreement. Some nodded. Others looked at the ground, uncomfortable with the way the truth often peeled back assumptions like paint on rusted metal. Ava didn't know how to respond. She had thought she was doing the right thing, protecting public safety, following guidelines. But all along, her judgment had been clouded by something deeper. Bias. Assumption. The silent belief that age meant weakness, that a battered motorcycle meant irresponsibility. And now, standing before a man with more courage in his silence than most men had in war, she felt the full weight of that mistake. Lopez, to his credit, stepped forward. "Colonel Harris," he said with quiet sincerity, "we didn't mean to treat you like a threat. We were following protocol. But I see now that wasn't enough. We were wrong. I was wrong." James gave him a slow nod, and that was all Lopez needed. Sometimes forgiveness didn't come in words but in the space between them. Then, just when the moment seemed ready to settle, Ava reached for her radio. "Dispatch," she said, trying to steady her voice, "we need to cancel the request for medical evaluation on subject James Harris. No further action required. Subject is clear." There was a pause, then static. "Copy that, Officer Johnson," came the reply. "Update received. Do you require assistance?" Ava hesitated, glancing at the wall of soldiers. "No," she said quietly. "Assistance already arrived." James slowly pulled the key from his jacket pocket and inserted it into the ignition. The Harley let out a low growl, familiar and strong, the kind of sound that didn't ask for attention but always received it. Captain Farrell stepped back, raising a hand. At that signal, all 50 soldiers shifted in perfect synchrony, forming a double line down the center of the street, boots striking pavement in rhythm. The people watching held their breath. It was no longer a town. It was a theater. And James Harris was riding through a story no one would forget. He gently revved the throttle. The engine responded like it always had, steady, loyal, and loud. He looked straight ahead, not at the crowd, not at the soldiers, not at the officers still standing in the echo of their own misjudgment. He looked at the road. Because that was where he belonged. Always had. As he pulled forward, the soldiers remained still, their presence now a silent salute. The Harley rolled between them like a ghost from history, living and proud, not diminished by time but sharpened by it. Each boot he passed felt like another chapter closed, another scar honored. Behind him, Marcus stood near the gas station, a hand over his chest, eyes moist. He didn't cheer. He didn't clap. He simply watched, knowing that this moment was bigger than vindication. It was redemption, not just for Harris, but for everyone who had ever been forgotten after giving their all. Ava watched too, frozen as the man she had nearly arrested became the symbol of everything she'd sworn to protect. She didn't cry. But she didn't look away either. The last soldier in line was Captain Farrell. As Harris passed, Farrell saluted again, sharp and precise. And for the briefest moment, Harris looked at him and gave the smallest nod. It was enough. When the bike turned the corner and disappeared down the road, no one moved. It was as if the world had paused to let the man ride on his terms one more time. Long after the engine faded, the impact lingered. The soldiers boarded their vehicles and slowly pulled away, one Humvee at a time. The crowd began to disperse, quiet and respectful. The story was already spreading, through texts, whispers, social media. Everyone knew now. James Harris was not just an old man on a motorcycle. He was a living legacy. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed wasn't born of neglect. It was reverence. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The sound of the Humvees faded slowly into the distance, leaving behind only the whisper of tires against hot asphalt and the stunned silence of those who had witnessed the impossible. The street that had been a scene of confrontation just minutes earlier now felt like sacred ground. People lingered, unsure of what to do with their thoughts, their judgments, their sudden shift in perspective. The officers stood stiffly, their uniforms heavy with the weight of humiliation. Ava Johnson's hands remained clenched at her sides as if releasing them would cause the emotions swirling inside her to spill uncontrollably. She had meant to enforce the law, but what she had done instead was violate a far deeper code, the kind not written in any handbook, the code of human dignity. Behind her, Officer Lopez pulled out his phone, not to check messages but to silence the camera he had forgotten was still running. He had recorded the entire arrival, the salute, the formation of soldiers, and the roar of the Harley as it pulled away. He hadn't planned to post it, but something in him knew this footage wasn't for views. It was for memory. For reflection. He tucked the phone away, took a breath, and turned to Ava. "I didn't see it coming," he said softly. Ava didn't answer right away. She was staring down the street where James Harris had vanished. The engine's echo still lingered faintly in her ears, like a sermon that kept repeating itself long after the preacher was gone. "Neither did I," she finally whispered. Across the street, Marcus Williams stepped away from the curb. His shoulders were tense, not from fear but from adrenaline and the deep stirring of something personal. He had made the call. He had sounded the alarm. But what he didn't expect was how much that decision would affect him. He had known Harris was special. That much was clear after years of brief, respectful exchanges at the pump. But the magnitude of what he had just witnessed shook him in a way that no war story, no medal, no headline ever could. It was something about the stillness of Harris's composure. The way he absorbed disrespect without flinching. That was the kind of strength Marcus had seen in foxholes, in firefights, in the desperate hours when no one was sure they'd live to see the morning. Marcus turned back into his station and leaned on the counter, staring blankly at the dusty register. Outside, the world was moving again. Cars were slowly beginning to roll down the street. Some honked out of habit, some just to break the tension. A few people waved at Marcus, offering silent thanks or nods of respect. He barely noticed. His mind was far from the present. It was 30 years ago, in a desert, beside a burning convoy, with a young sergeant holding a rifle and whispering a prayer. That same kind of resolve. That same kind of silence. At the police precinct across town, Sheriff Martin Smith was just stepping into his office when the front desk called up to him. "Sheriff, we've got a call coming in from Fort Carson. Line 1. They're asking for you directly." Smith paused mid-step. That wasn't common. Military usually went through formal channels, not personal lines. He picked up the receiver. "Sheriff Smith." The voice on the other end was firm, controlled, but edged with a hint of tension. "This is Captain George Farrell, Fort Carson. I'm calling regarding an incident this morning involving Colonel James Harris." Smith sat down slowly, sensing the gravity behind every word. "Yes, Captain. I've just been briefed. I understand there was confusion on the part of my officers." Farrell was silent for a beat. Then, "Colonel Harris is not pursuing legal action. He doesn't want revenge or headlines. But we can't ignore what happened. Not because of him, but because of what he represents. He is a symbol, Sheriff. And today that symbol was tarnished in front of civilians and soldiers alike." Smith rubbed his temple. "Captain, I understand. I know Officer Johnson. She's not reckless. She's young. Green. Made a mistake. We all make mistakes, Sheriff. The question is how we respond. I'm requesting, not demanding, that your department undergo a special training initiative. It'll be conducted in partnership with our base. Your officers will spend a week here. They'll learn what it means to wear a uniform that's more than cloth. One that's built on sacrifice. Smith leaned back. He could already feel the political pressure building, but deeper than that, he felt the moral weight of what Farrell was saying. It'll be done, Captain. You have my word. Back on Highway 340, the sun was reaching its peak, casting long shadows under telephone poles and cornfields. The wind rolled through the grass like whispers of everything unsaid. At a bend in the road, James Harris rode alone. No cameras. No salutes. No crowd. Just the road and the steady rhythm of the engine beneath him. He didn't think of what had happened as a victory. He didn't crave validation or justice. In his world, true strength meant doing what was right without waiting for someone to notice. But he did feel something stir in him. Not pride, exactly. Not relief. Just a quiet knowing that he had stood his ground not with anger, but with stillness. And it had been enough. He slowed as his property came into view. The White House. The rocking chair on the porch. The field stretching out behind it like a memory still being written. He pulled the Harley under the old maple tree beside the barn, killed the engine, and listened to the silence. Birds chirped again. Cows lowed in the distance. The world, uncaring of headlines or parades, had kept turning. He removed his helmet, placed it gently on the seat, and walked toward the tractor still sitting half disassembled in the gravel. It was where he left it that morning. Waiting patiently. Just like him. He crouched down, wiping his hands on a rag and reaching into the hydraulic system with the precision of a man who'd fixed everything from engines to broken hearts in young soldiers' chests. In the distance, he heard a faint roar, maybe another motorcycle, maybe just wind. But he didn't look up. He kept working. Because that's what men like James Harris did. They didn't pause to bask in moments. They didn't measure their worth in salutes. They got back to work. Quietly. Unshakably. As if nothing had happened. By the time the sun began its slow descent over Monroe, word of what had happened on Main Street had already swept through the town like wildfire. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was the talk of every diner booth, every barbershop chair, every front porch where neighbors gathered to sip sweet tea and watch the sky turn gold. People spoke of James Harris not as the old man with the loud motorcycle but as the man who'd made 50 soldiers snap to attention in the middle of a quiet street. They spoke of the salute, of the formation, of the captain who'd called him Colonel with a voice full of reverence. Videos of the moment had spread like brushfire online, racking up thousands of views within hours, but for those who were there, no screen could capture the gravity of it. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a revelation. At the Monroe Police Department, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Silence hovered like a reprimand no one could shake off. Officers sat at their desks quieter than usual, eyes flickering toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in and say it had all been a dream. Officer Ava Johnson sat in the briefing room, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, but her thoughts were far from composed. She had barely spoken since returning to the station, and when she did, it was clipped and formal. Her fellow officers didn't joke with her like they used to. Not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what to say. The weight of what had happened was too fresh, too real. Captain George Farrell's voice echoed through her mind, especially that one sentence that seemed to split the air. This man served 3 tours in Vietnam, carried out intelligence operations in the Gulf and Afghanistan, personally trained hundreds of U.S. Army officers including myself. She hadn't been able to sleep the night before. Her mind kept playing back the moment Harris had turned to her and asked how long she had worn the badge. She realized now that it hadn't been a question. It had been a mirror. That afternoon, Chief Martin Smith called a department-wide meeting. Every officer was required to attend. He stood at the front of the room, arms folded across his chest, face somber. "I won't waste your time," he said. What happened yesterday can't happen again. Not just because it embarrassed us. Not just because it went viral. But because we failed to see the man in front of us. A man who deserved better. He paused, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Ava. We owe him a debt. Not just an apology, but in action. He turned to the whiteboard behind him and wrote 2 words in bold letters, Training Initiative. Starting next week, we'll be sending every active duty officer to Fort Carson. Captain Farrell has offered a specialized program to help us understand what it really means to serve. You won't just read about valor. You'll meet it face to face. Murmurs filled the room. Some officers nodded with understanding. Others looked down, ashamed. Smith continued, this isn't punishment. This is perspective. We protect our communities by knowing who built them. And some of those builders wear old jackets and ride rusty bikes. That evening, Ava sat alone on a bench outside the precinct. Her uniform felt heavier than it had yesterday. She looked at the streetlights beginning to flicker on one by one, painting long shadows across the sidewalk. Her thoughts drifted not to the embarrassment or the fallout, but to the way Harris had sat on that bike, unmoved, surrounded by doubt but not defined by it. It wasn't just that he'd been a colonel. It was the way he had carried himself, without anger, without arrogance, without a single need to prove himself. Across town, in a modest home at the edge of a field, James Harris sat on his porch with a mug of black coffee in his hand. The Harley rested under the maple tree, cleaned now, its chrome catching the last light of day. He looked out over his land, past the rows of corn and the idle tractor still missing its part. There was peace here. A peace earned the hard way. He wasn't thinking about the confrontation. He was thinking about how it had taken 50 soldiers and a ringing title for the world to pause and see him. That fact saddened him more than the disrespect ever had. He wasn't bitter. He was tired. Not from age, but from knowing how easily people forgot what mattered. For decades he had served quietly, trained others, poured his life into something bigger than himself. And yet, a single pair of sunglasses and a badge had tried to strip that away in one morning. He didn't blame the officers, not truly. He blamed the erosion of memory. The way time made people forget that dignity wasn't earned in moments, it was earned in miles. Back in town, the grocery store closed early. Not for a holiday, not for weather, but because the owner wanted to write a letter. A real letter, the kind folded and sealed and sent with a stamp. It was addressed to Colonel James Harris. He didn't know what to say yet, only that silence would feel wrong. In the diner, the waitress who had once rolled her eyes at the sound of that old Harley now told the story to anyone who asked. He just sat there, calm as a monk, while those kids acted like he was a problem. And then boom. Soldiers. Real ones. Came out of nowhere and stood like statues. You should have seen the look on their faces when they saluted. At Fort Carson, Captain Farrell sat at his desk, reviewing the footage. Not for legal reasons, not for reports. He watched it because it reminded him of the man who had changed his life. He remembered Harris from 2 decades ago, gray then, but strong. A leader without theatrics, the kind who knew your name, even when no one else did. The kind who walked into fire first. Farrell leaned back in his chair, letting the video replay once more. It wasn't about the soldiers or the spectacle. It was about the truth finally revealed. James Harris was no longer invisible. He was remembered. Not for medals, not for rank, but for the strength that came from restraint. And though the world had nearly passed him by, for one fleeting moment, it had stopped to salute. The following morning, Sheriff Martin Smith sat in his office with the blinds drawn halfway, the mid-morning sun striping across his desk in broken slants. He hadn't touched his coffee. It sat cooling beside a stack of memos and a printed email marked urgent from Fort Carson. But Smith didn't need to read it again. He had already gone over every word at least a dozen times since last night. The tone was respectful, measured, but beneath it was something unmistakable: weight. Not just institutional weight, but moral weight. The kind that pressed not just on policies, but on conscience. The message was clear: what had happened to Colonel Harris had cut deeper than a PR mishap. It had struck a nerve at the core of what it meant to be American. Smith leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He had been sheriff for 15 years, long enough to see his share of misjudgments, long enough to know that mistakes, even good faith ones, could ripple far beyond the moment they were made. He had already spoken to officers Johnson and Lopez privately. Ava had sat across from him like a soldier who knew she'd breached a line she could never uncross. She hadn't made excuses. She hadn't cried. But the look in her eyes had said everything: shame, regret, and something more important, the desire to make it right. When the knock came on his door, Smith didn't look up immediately. "Come in," he said, his voice low. Captain George Farrell stepped inside, crisp in uniform, carrying with him the presence of someone used to command but wise enough not to wield it carelessly. Smith stood and extended a hand. "Captain," he said. "I appreciate you coming in person." Farrell shook his hand firmly. "Sheriff, thank you for receiving me." They sat across from each other, a quiet tension lingering between them like a line of chalk neither wanted to cross. "I read the email," Smith said, tapping the paper. "I agree with everything you proposed." Farrell nodded. "I'm not here to demand punishment or press for disciplinary action. Colonel Harris made it very clear he doesn't want anyone's career destroyed over this." "He could have," Smith said quietly. "And no one would have blamed him." "That's not who he is," Farrell replied. "But this can't end with an apology and a few reassigned shifts." Smith nodded solemnly. "The training program you mentioned, we'll do it. Not just Johnson and Lopez. Everyone. Every officer. Every rank." Farrell's expression softened just a little. "It's not just about honoring the past, Sheriff. It's about correcting the present. Harris isn't the only veteran who walks among us unrecognized. He's just the one who stayed silent long enough for the world to forget." Smith looked down for a moment. "Truth is, I've driven past that farm 100 times. Saw that old Harley parked under the tree. Never once did I stop to wonder who he really was." "You're not alone," Farrell said. "Most of us don't ask until it's too late." The two men sat in reflective silence for a while, the noise of the world muffled behind office walls. Finally, Farrell rose and extended a folder. "This contains the proposed schedule. We'll begin next Monday. Week-long sessions, rotating shifts, practical and historical modules. Your officers will hear directly from retired veterans, some of them their own neighbors. The goal is to reintroduce the human behind the uniform." Smith took the folder with both hands, as though accepting more than just paper. Later that afternoon, in the municipal precinct's main hall, Smith stood before his gathered officers. The room was filled with tension. Not shame, but anticipation. Change was coming, and no one quite knew what form it would take. "Starting next week," Smith began, "we begin a new training program in partnership with Fort Carson. This isn't punishment. It's preparation, for the kind of law enforcement that honors not just rules but people." He paused, glancing toward Ava Johnson, who stood near the back of the room, her arms crossed tightly. "We've all made assumptions. We've all overlooked what was right in front of us. But now we've been given a second chance to do better. To see more. To listen longer." Ava raised her hand. "Sheriff, may I say something?" Smith nodded. She stepped forward slowly, the eyes of the room following her. "Last week," she began, "I made a mistake. A serious one. I disrespected a man who deserves more than any badge or title I'll ever wear. But what I learned wasn't just about him. It was about all of us. Every person we stop on the street carries a story. Every wrinkle, every scar, every silence has meaning. And if we're not listening, we're not protecting. We're just policing. Her voice cracked slightly, but she held firm. I thought I knew what my job was. Now I understand it's much more than writing tickets or following procedures. It's about treating people like they matter, even when they don't look like they do. There was silence at first. Then one officer clapped. Then another. And soon the room filled with the sound of hands coming together, not out of politeness, but out of recognition. What Ava had said was real. It had happened in their town, on their watch. And now it was time to face it. 2 days later, a new bulletin board appeared in the precinct's hallway. It was labeled, Faces of Service, and on it were photos of veterans from the town, some young, most old, some in full dress, others in worn overalls. In the center was a black and white photograph of a younger James Harris, in fatigues, holding a map in one hand and a radio in the other, eyes alert, mouth set in quiet determination. Below the photo, in bold letters, it read, Colonel James M. Harris, remember the story before you write yours. At Fort Carson, preparations began for the first training wave. Veterans volunteered eagerly, many of them having known Harris in one way or another. Some had trained under him. Others had heard stories passed down like legend. One by one, they prepared to share their truth, not from podiums, but from heart to heart. Back on the farm, Harris continued his work as usual. The tractor was halfway repaired, tools scattered neatly on a cloth. He hummed to himself, a habit picked up in youth and never abandoned. He didn't watch the news. He didn't check the internet. He didn't know about the bulletin board or the training sessions or the speeches being given in his name. But he felt it. In the air. In the way cars slowed a little when they passed his property. In the silence that now held respect instead of suspicion. He didn't need the world to remember who he was. He just needed it to treat the forgotten with the dignity they never stopped deserving. The sun hovered low over Highway 340, casting long golden streaks over the fields as Officer Ava Johnson guided her patrol car toward a quiet stretch of road she'd only traveled once before. Her hands were tight on the steering wheel, not from tension, but from the deliberate effort of keeping herself steady. The visit she was about to make wasn't official. There was no call for backup, no paperwork involved, no citation to deliver. But in her mind, it was the most important call she'd ever made. The radio was off. The silence inside the car pressed against her thoughts, amplifying every memory of the day she had stood before a man who had every reason to lash out and instead gave her patience. It was that patience that haunted her, not because it made her feel small, but because it reminded her how large some people become simply by standing still. As the road curved toward the distant trees, she saw it, the simple white farmhouse, the long gravel driveway, the garden brimming with early spring flowers, and there under the wide arms of a maple tree, the unmistakable shape of the old Harley resting in the shade like a sleeping lion. She pulled into the driveway slowly and turned off the engine. For a long moment, she didn't move. She looked at the house, the porch with its rocking chairs, the faint movement of a curtain in a side window. Part of her expected the man to step out before she knocked. But no one came. Finally, she stepped out and made her way up the worn path to the porch. The scent of wildflowers drifted through the air, and from somewhere in the barn, she heard the faint clank of metal. She followed the sound, her boots crunching the gravel, until she reached the open doors. There, under the chassis of a green John Deere tractor, lay Colonel James Harris, grease on his coveralls, socket wrench in hand. He didn't look up right away. Just kept working, like the world hadn't come to his doorstep once again. Ava cleared her throat softly. "Colonel Harris," she said, her voice careful but clear. The sound of tools stopped. A moment later, Harris slid out from beneath the tractor, sat up slowly, and wiped his hands on a rag. His face was the same, calm, composed, quietly observant. "Officer Johnson," he said, nodding once. "Didn't expect to see you here." She tried to smile, but it didn't quite come together. I was hoping to speak with you. If that's all right. He stood, wiped his palms one last time, and gestured toward the porch. I just brewed a fresh pot. You drink coffee? Yes, sir, she said, surprised at the ease in his voice. They walked side by side back to the porch. Inside, the kitchen was modest and clean, the table a worn oak slab that looked like it had hosted 100 quiet breakfasts. Harris poured the coffee into 2 mismatched blue mugs and set one in front of her. Then he sat, arms relaxed, posture straight. Go ahead, he said. Say what you came to say. Ava stared into the black surface of the coffee for a second before lifting her eyes. I came to say I'm sorry. Not just for how I treated you that day, but for everything I assumed before I even spoke to you. Harris didn't nod or interrupt. He simply waited. She continued, her voice steadying. When I saw you on that bike, I thought of danger. I thought of recklessness. I didn't see a veteran. I didn't see someone who had sacrificed more than I could imagine. I just saw age. And that scared me, so I acted like I had control. But I didn't. I was wrong. Harris sipped his coffee. Fear makes people do foolish things, he said. It's not always malice. Sometimes it's just ignorance with a badge. Ava flinched slightly, but she didn't disagree. That training we're going to do at Fort Carson, she said, I'm not just attending because the department ordered it. I want to be there. I want to understand what I missed. Harris looked out the window at the pasture, where a few cows grazed lazily under the setting sun. Understanding doesn't come from lectures, he said. It comes from listening. And most of the time, it comes from being wrong and staying around long enough to learn why. Ava leaned forward. May I ask you something, sir? Of course. Why didn't you tell us who you were that day? You could have stopped everything with a word. Harris turned back to her, the corners of his mouth rising in a faint smile. If a man needs to announce his worth, maybe he doesn't have much to begin with. Besides, I wasn't interested in escaping judgment. I wanted to see where it would go. She blinked. You were testing us? No. I was observing. That's what age teaches you, to watch before you speak. You learn more that way. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of recognition. Ava looked around the room, the photos on the wall, the old clock ticking steadily. You've lived a full life, she said softly. Still living it, he replied. Until I'm not. She smiled at that. Then her face turned serious again. What would you have done if the soldiers hadn't come? If no one made that call? Harris shrugged. Eventually, I would have gone with you. You had the numbers. You had the law. But you didn't have the truth. And the truth always finds its way through. Ava looked down at her hands, folded tightly around the mug. I want to do better. Not just as an officer, but as a person. Harris reached across the table and tapped the back of her hand gently with 2 fingers. Then you already are. She exhaled slowly, and something in her chest loosened, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Thank you, she said, and she meant it with everything she had. As the sun dipped below the trees, Ava rose to leave. Harris walked her back to the patrol car. She paused by the Harley, admiring it with a new lens. It's older than I am, she said. But it still rides, he replied. Still gets me where I need to go. She nodded. I think I understand now. Harris gave her one last look, filled with something deeper than forgiveness, understanding. Respect doesn't come from a uniform, he said. It comes from how you treat the people who don't wear one. As she drove away down the gravel road, the rearview mirror caught a glimpse of Harris walking back to his porch, the Harley resting in the shade behind him. And for the first time, Ava saw him not as a legend, not as a symbol, but as a man, whole, quiet, and unshakably human. The following week, the training program at Fort Carson began under a sharp blue sky. Patrol cars from Monroe pulled into the base's wide lot one by one, carrying officers in freshly ironed uniforms and minds marked by recent reflection. There was no ceremony, no fanfare. Just quiet steps across concrete as each officer made their way into the halls where respect was not taught with lectures but through stories carved into the hearts of men and women who had lived through things far beyond textbooks and courtrooms. Inside the main briefing room, a banner hung across the front wall: "To serve with honor is to understand those who served before you." Beneath it sat a row of veterans, most with silver hair, some with missing limbs, others with the steel still in their gaze. They didn't smile for attention. They didn't speak to impress. They were there to remind. Ava Johnson sat in the front row, back straight, not out of discipline but out of deference. Lopez sat beside her, quieter than usual. The first veteran who stood to speak wasn't a general or a colonel. He was a former medic who had once carried a wounded 19-year-old through enemy fire with nothing but a torn belt and stubborn lungs. "I wasn't brave," he said. "I was scared. But I knew the man beside me deserved a chance to go home. That was enough." His voice was soft, but it landed like thunder. Later, in small breakout groups, the officers walked through simulators designed not to mimic violence, but to test empathy. They watched interviews with veterans talking about their return to civilian life. The loneliness. The invisibility. The ache of being misunderstood by the country they had once sworn to defend. For many officers, it was the first time they had listened without needing to speak, without preparing a defense. By midweek, something had changed. They stopped seeing the old man walking downtown as a potential hazard. They started seeing a survivor. A teacher. A human being with a weight they couldn't measure just by looking. That shift wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. But like most real changes, it stuck. At the end of the final day, Captain Farrell called for a brief closing session. He stood before the gathered officers, his hands clasped behind his back. The room hushed. "You met veterans this week," he said. "You listened to their stories. But what matters most now is what you carry back. You are entrusted with power. But that power means nothing if it doesn't come with the discipline to listen before acting, and the humility to admit when you didn't." He paused, then looked directly at Ava. "We don't need perfect officers. We need honorable ones." She nodded slowly, a quiet strength rising behind her eyes. She would carry that sentence for the rest of her life. A few days later, Ava returned to patrol, but the uniform felt different now. Not heavier, just more meaningful. Every stop she made, every person she spoke to, came with an awareness she hadn't possessed before. The badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a promise to approach each human being with care, especially the ones the world had grown too accustomed to ignoring. On her first day back, she passed a familiar curve on Highway 340 and slowed instinctively. The fence posts were lined with blooming wildflowers, and at the end of the long gravel driveway, she saw the Harley glinting in the sunlight under the old maple tree. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. Some visits weren't meant to be repeated but to be remembered. Inside the house, James Harris sat at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the road without watching for anything. He didn't expect thanks or recognition. The world was already moving again, as it always did. He had lived long enough to know that real change doesn't come with applause. It comes quietly, in conversations between strangers, in the restraint of someone choosing patience over pride. The incident that had once threatened to reduce him to a viral headline had, without intention, revealed something greater. Not his past, but the state of everyone else's present. And that was worth more than a parade. Back at the precinct, a new officer pinned her badge on for the first time. As she stepped into her squad car, she noticed something different about the atmosphere around her seniors. A softness in their voices. A pause before speaking. Stories being told about veterans not as facts, but as people. On the wall, the photo of Colonel Harris remained. Still black and white, still stern, but now surrounded by letters from officers and civilians alike. Some of apology. Some of gratitude. Some of realization. Ava stood in front of that wall one evening, reading a new note pinned beside the frame. It was from a high school senior who had watched the footage online and had since decided to join the Air Force. "I want to be someone who stands for something," the letter said. Like he did. Ava smiled and tucked her hands into her jacket pockets, her fingers brushing against a small folded paper. It was the slip of notebook paper Harris had handed her quietly before she left his porch days earlier. She hadn't shown it to anyone. She unfolded it now, reading the neat handwriting once again. "It's not the title you wear. It's the choices you make when no one is looking. Keep choosing well." She folded it carefully and returned it to her pocket. Weeks passed. Then months. The memory of that day on Main Street lived on not just in footage or stories, but in behavior. In posture. In how younger officers now took extra time with elderly citizens. In how complaints dropped. In how patients began to feel more like protocol than a burden. The town of Monroe didn't change overnight. But it changed. And in the heart of that change was a man who had asked for nothing more than to be left in peace. One summer morning, a new recruit at Fort Carson asked Captain Farrell about Colonel Harris. "Do you think he knows how many people he's impacted?" Farrell smiled, then looked toward the horizon. "He doesn't care. That's what makes him who he is." On a quiet stretch of highway, the low rumble of a Harley rolled past the trees. Steady. Confident. Unbothered by the noise of a world always in a rush to forget. And as it disappeared into the warmth of the rising sun, one truth remained: some salutes don't need to be seen to be felt. Some legacies don't need to be declared. They just ride on. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?